in which an affair unfolds, and we see the damage wrought upon the scorned. Chapter 13. Levine put on big boots and, for the first time, a cloth jacket instead of his fur coat, and went about the farm, striding across streams that dazzled the eyes with their shining in the sun, stepping now on ice, now in sticky mud. Spring is the time of plans and projects, and going out to the yard, Levine, like a tree in spring, not yet knowing where and how its young shoots and branches, still confined in swollen buds, will grow, did not himself know very well which parts of his beloved estate he would occupy himself with now, but felt that he was filled with the very finest plans and projects. First of all, he went to see the cattle. The cows had been let out into the pen, and their new coats shining, warmed by the sun, they lowed, asking to go to pasture. Having admired the cows, familiar to him down to the smallest details, Levine ordered them driven to pasture and the calves let out into the pen. The cowherd ran merrily to get ready for the pasture, the dairymaids hitching up their skirts, their bare, white, as yet untanned legs splashing in the mud, ran with switches after the calves and drove them, lowing and crazed with spring joy, into the yard. After admiring that year's young, which were exceptionally good, the early calves were as big as a peasant's cow. Pava's 3-month-old daughter was the size of a yearling. Levine gave orders for a trough to be brought out and hay to be put in the racks, but it turned out that the racks, made in the autumn and left for winter in the unused pen, were broken. He sent for the carpenter, who by his order ought to have been working on the thresher, but it turned out that the carpenter was repairing the harrows, which ought to have been repaired before Lent. That was extremely vexing to Levin. What vexed him was the repetition of this eternal slovenliness of farm work. The racks, as he learned, not needed in winter, had been taken to the workhorses' stable, and there it got broken, since they'd been lightly made for calves. Besides that, it also turned out that the harrows and all the agricultural tools, which he had ordered to be looked over and repaired back in the winter, and for which purpose 3 carpenters had been hired, were still not repaired, and the harrows were being repaired when it was already time for the harrowing. Levine sent for the steward, but at once went himself to look for him. The steward, radiant as everything else that day, was coming from the threshing floor in his fleece-trimmed coat, snapping a straw in his hands. "Why is the carpenter not at the thresher?" "I mean to tell you about that yesterday. The harrows need repair. It's time for plowing." "And what about last winter?" "And what do you want with the carpenter, sir?" "Where are the racks for the calves' yard?" "I ordered them to be put in place." "What can you do with these folk?" said the steward, waving his arm. "Not with these people, but with this steward," said Levine, flaring up. "What on earth do I keep you for?" he shouted. But remembering that this was not going to help, he stopped in mid-speech and merely sighed. "Well, can we start sowing?" he asked after a pause. "Beyond Turkino we can. Tomorrow or the day after." "And the clover?" "I sent Vasily and Mishka. They're sowing it, only I don't know if they'll get through. It's soggy." "How many acres?" 16. Why not the whole of it? Shouted Levine. That clover was being sown on only 16 and not 50 acres was still more vexing. Planting clover, both in theory and in his own experience, was only successful if it was done as early as possible, almost over the snow, and Levine could never get that done. No people. What can you do with these folk? 3 didn't show up, and now Semyon. Well, you could have let the straw wait. That's what I did. Where are the people? 5 are making compote. He meant compost. 4 are shoveling oats. Lest they go bad, Konstantin Dmitrich. Levine knew very well that lest they go bad meant that the English seed oats were already spoiled. Again, what he had ordered had not been done. But I told you back in Lent, the vent pipes, he shouted. Don't worry, we'll get everything done on time. Levine waved his hand angrily, went to the barn to have a look at the oats, and returned to the stables. The oats were not spoiled yet, but the workers were transferring them with shovels, whereas they should simply have been dumped directly on the barn floor, and after giving orders about that, and taking 2 workers from there to plant clover, Levine's vexation with the steward subsided. Besides, the day was so fine that it was impossible to be angry. Ignat, he cried to the coachman, who had rolled up his sleeves and was washing the carriage by the well. Saddle me up. Which do you want, sir? Well, take Kolpik. Right, sir. While the horse was being saddled, Levine again called over the steward, who was hanging around in view, to make it up with him. Began telling him about the impending spring work and his plans for the estate. The carting of manure had to begin earlier, so that everything would be finished before the early mowing. The far field had to be plowed continually so as to keep it fallow. The hay was to be got in not on half shares with the peasants, but by hired workers. The steward listened attentively, and obviously made an effort to approve of the master's suggestions. But all the same, he had that hopeless and glum look, so familiar to Levine, and always so irritating to him. This look said, That's all very well, but it's as God grants. Nothing so upset Levine as this tone, but it was a tone common to all stewards, as many of them as he had employed. They all had the same attitude towards his proposals, and therefore he now no longer got angry, but became upset and felt himself still more roused to fight this somehow elemental force for which he could find no other name than as God grants, and which was constantly opposed to him. If we manage, Konstantin Dmitrich, said the steward. Why shouldn't you? We need to hire some more workers, another 15 men or so, but they don't come. There were some today, but they asked 70 rubles each for the summer. Levine kept silent. Again this force opposed him. He knew that, hard as they tried, they had never been able to hire more than 40 workers. 37, 38 at the real price. They might get 40, but not more. Yet he could not help fighting even so. Send to Suri, to Cheferovka, if they don't come. We must look. So I will, Vasily Fyodorovich said glumly. And the horses have also gone weak. We'll buy more. Oh, I know, he added, laughing. You'd have it all smaller and poorer, but this year I won't let you do it your way. I'll do everything myself. You don't seem to sleep much as it is. More fun for us under the master's eye. So they're sowing clover beyond Birchdale? I'll go and have a look, he said, mounting the small, light bay Kolpik brought by the coachman. You won't get across the brook, Konstantin Dmitrich, cried the coachman. Well, through the woods, then. And at the brisk amble of the good, too long and active little horse, who snorted over the puddles and tugged at the reins, Levine rode across the mud of the yard, out of the gate, and into the fields. If Levine felt happy in the cattle and farmyards, he felt still happier in the fields, swaying rhythmically to the amble of his good little mount, drinking in the warm yet fresh smell of the snow, and the air as he went through the forest over the granular, subsiding snow that still remained here and there, with tracks spreading in it. He rejoiced at each of his trees, with moss reviving on its bark and buds swelling. When he rode out of the forest, green wheat spread before him in a smooth, velvety carpet over a huge space, with not a single bare or marshy patch, and only spotted here and there in the hollows with the remains of the melting snow. Nor was he angered by the sight of a peasant horse and colt trampling his green wheat. He told the mujik he meant to drive them away, nor by the mocking and stupid reply of the mujik Ipat, whom he met and asked, "Well, Ipat, time for sowing?" Have to plough first, Constantine Dmitrich," replied Ipat. The further he rode, the happier he felt, and plans for the estate, one better than another, arose in his mind. To plant willows along the meridional lines of all the fields, so that the snow would not stay too long under them. To divide them into 6 fertilized fields and 3 set aside for grass. To build a cattle yard at the far end of the field and dig a pond. To set up movable pens for the cattle so as to manure the fields. And then he would have 800 acres of wheat, 250 of potatoes, and 400 of clover, and not a single acre exhausted. In such dreams, turning the horse carefully along the borders so as not to trample his green wheat, he rode up to the workers who were sowing clover. The cart with the seed stood not at the edge, but in the field, and the winter wheat was all dug up by the wheels and the horse. The 2 workers were sitting on a balk, probably taking turns smoking a pipe. The soil in the cart, with which the seed was mixed, had not been rubbed fine, but was caked or frozen in lumps. Seeing the master, the worker Vasily went to the cart, while Mishka started sowing. This was not good, but Levin seldom got angry with hired workers. When Vasily came up, Levin told him to take the horse to the edge. "Never mind, sir. It'll grow back," Vasily replied. "No discussion, please," said Levin. "Just do as you're told." "Right, sir," said Vasily, and he took hold of the horse's head. "And the sowing is first-rate, Constantine Dmitrich," he said, fawning. "Only the walking's pretty terrible. You drag 10 pounds on each shoe." "And why hasn't the soil been sifted?" Levin asked. "We brick it up with our hands," Vasily answered, taking some seed and rubbing the lump between his hands. It was not Vasily's fault that they had given him unsifted soil, but it was vexing all the same. Having already experienced more than once the usefulness of the remedy he knew for stifling his vexation and turning all that seemed bad back to good, Levin employed it here as well. He looked at how Mishka strode along, lugging huge lumps of earth stuck to each foot, got off his horse, took the seed basket from Vasily, and went to sow. "Where did you stop?" Vasily pointed to a mark with his foot, and Levin went as well as he could, scattering the seeds mixed with soil. It was hard walking, as through a swamp, and having gone 1 row, Levin became sweaty, stopped, and handed the seed basket back. "Well, master, mind you don't scold me for this row come summer," said Vasily. "What for?" Levin said gaily, already feeling the effectiveness of the remedy. "You'll see come summer. It'll be different. You just take a look where it sowed last spring. So neat. You know, Constantine Dmitrich, it seems I try and do it as I would for my own father. I don't like doing bad work myself, and I tell others the same. If the master's pleased, so are we. Look there now," Vasily said, pointing to the field. "It brings joy to your heart." "It's a fine spring, Vasily." "Such a spring as the old folk don't remember. I went home, and our old man there has also sowed 2 acres of wheat. He says you can't tell it from rye." "How long have you been sowing wheat?" "Why, it's you that taught us 2 years ago, and you gave me 2 bushels. We sold 1/4 of it, and sowed the rest." "Well, make sure you rub out these lumps," said Levin, going towards his horse, "and keep an eye on Mishka. If it comes up well, you'll get 50 kopecks an acre. Thank you kindly. Seems we're right pleased with you anyway. Levin mounted his horse and rode to the field where last year's clover was, and to the one that had been plowed for the spring wheat. The clover sprouting among the stubble was wonderful. It was all revived already and steadily greening among the broken stalks of last year's wheat. The horse sank fetlock deep, and each of his hooves made a sucking sound as it was pulled from the half-thawed ground. It was quite impossible to go across the plowed field. It held only where there was ice, but in the thawed furrows the legs sank over the fetlocks. The plowing was excellent. In 2 days they could harrow and begin sowing. Everything was beautiful. Everything was cheerful. Levin rode back across the brook, hoping the water had subsided. And indeed he did get across and frightened 2 ducks. There must also be woodcock, he thought, and just at the turning to his house he met a forester who confirmed his guess about woodcock. Levin went home at a trot so as to arrive in time to have dinner and prepare a gun for the evening. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.